In this tutorial series, you will learn how to integrate any 3D objects seamlessly into backplates. For part 2, you will learn how to set up an environment dome for use in reflections and refractions, match it as close as possible to our backplate, and add some final tweaks to bring all different elements together. So in part 1 of the series, we already created our basic lighting, so we added a sunlight and a skylight to overall match the lighting conditions of our backplate, to match the direction of the light, to match the softness and intensity of the shadow, and so on. Now in this part, we're going to focus on how we can add a reflective and refractive environment here, because at the moment, as soon as our shader has some kind of reflections in there, it doesn't really work yet because we didn't really set up any kind of environment in here yet. So in order to check out what's happening in my environment, I normally tend to create a fully reflective material. Let's call this one here shader metal. Then we add the reflection all the way to white and also make it a fully metallic shader. Then assign it here to our shading dummy. And then let's also put this diffuse value in here, which is the minimum reflection value in case that you have the metalness set to 1. So let's put this also all the way to pure white. That means that our shader now has 100% reflectivity across the whole surface, no matter from which angle we are viewing it at. And then we can discuss about what we're now seeing in here. So first of all, we have all of this area up here, which is completely black. And that just comes from having set up a reflection and refraction override here earlier in the VRay environment overrides. And you will see if I turn this one off, then it looks like this whole thing here becomes transparent, but that's actually not the case. What is now happening is that it's using this backplate here as the reflective environment. And because this backplate here is set to this screen projection mode, because we use it as a backplate, it kind of gets the illusion that this object becomes actually transparent. So if I now switch this one off to black again, then you can see that everything now turns black. So what we're going to do is to just enable back our reflection and refraction override. And then later on, we're going to put something here in the environment so that we can still use our backplate. And we also have here something showing up in the reflection. And the other thing that we can see already is that we have some reflections already showing up here in the lower part of our shading dummy. And that is actually the ground plane in here. Remember, this one we set up to be a matte object and to receive the shadows. So that means it will receive the shadows in here. We can still see our backplate and also generates an alpha channel for us. But it also means that it's fully visible in the reflections here by default. We can also see that we have the reflection of the actual shadow. So this shadow is here also being reflected back into our shading dummy. And that becomes important for some later study of this tutorial. Just want to make sure that you notice that there's also a shadow here in the reflection appearing. So because this dummy shader that we set up in here has 100% reflectivity, you can immediately notice that the shader for the ground plane is a little bit too bright, because we can see that this floor here doesn't really match the overall brightness of our backplate floor. So we have to go inside the floor match shader and then just lower down this diffuse value, for example, to something like 15. And again, because this shader here is 100% reflective, we just need to make sure that this shader here, or this kind of color value here, kind of matches in terms of brightness to those ones in the backplate, because then also we have the right amount of GI bounce light that's bouncing back onto our shading dummy. And by having this purely 100% reflective shader, you can very easily match these kind of intensities in here. Now you will see that the reflection of our floor is actually much more simple than our backplate itself. So we have this kind of pattern here in the backplate, and this object is also placed on this kind of pattern here. We have all of those small details in here, and all of those don't really show up in the reflection of our object, because we just use this very simple floor mat material in here that basically just consists out of this one diffuse value in here and has nothing else really set up. So in the VRay properties for this ground plane, there's also this option to use this matte for reflection and refraction. Once we enable this, we can see what happens. So when enabling this option, our ground plane also becomes a matte object for the reflections and refractions in our scene. And that means that we have some part of the backplate here showing through already. What happens internally is that the backplate is projected basically onto the ground plane from the camera. And like this way we can see these kind of lines here showing up from the backplate. In this scene, we're not going to use this approach here because it has some kind of problems. Let's discuss briefly what those problems are with this approach. So first of all, you can see that the colors which are appearing here in the reflections, they don't really seem to match perfectly to the ones in our backplate. That's because we use the same backplate that is already post-processed and tone mapped to project back into the part where we already set up some masks for the tone mapping for our linear part of the image. So if you remember from part 1, we added these different tone mapping procedures in here, and this way our reflection gets some additional tinting or additional color mapping, which by using this approach is very difficult to adjust or to fix because we're using the same image for the backplate and also for this part here in the reflections. We're not able to adjust the colors in this reflection part here separately. And another reason is that we need to build now some kind of environment that connects seamlessly with this part here of the floor. We have this very distinctive lines here showing up, and this will be near impossible to kind of make a seamless transition from this floor part to the rest of our environment. So in this case, the easiest way is to not use this kind of ground plane or matte object ground plane in the reflections at all. And that's why I go here in the object properties and then just disable the visibility for the reflection and refraction. And now we have a pure black reflection, which at the moment is derived entirely from the reflection and refraction override. And now we don't need to care about the ground plane anymore and the connection between the ground plane and the rest of our environment, but we just need to create one whole geometry dome that is being used for the reflections, and that we're gonna do in the next step now. So now in order to build our reflective and refractive environment, we need to build some basic geometry and then use our HDRI to project that onto this geometry. So for this, I already set up some very basic geometry. Let me just unhide this. You can see we have this very simple geometry in here. And let's just hide this floor mat temporarily so that we can examine this geometry here better. But I just want you to notice that this floor mat here is floating slightly on top of this environment dome in here. That becomes important for a later step. But now let's just temporarily hide this floor mat, and we can just examine this geometry in here better. You can see it's just derived from a simple sphere where I kind of flattened out the bottom in here. And then I just have this smooth transition from the floor to this upper dome. And then I flipped the normals for this dome in here and went inside the object properties, enabled backface culling so that we can see through it from the other side. And now we can just easily assign a new VRay light material to our geometry dome, assign that and just put a VRay bitmap in here. And then we can load the HDRI that we downloaded here previously, and also make sure that this color here is set to black, because then we can actually see our map in the viewport by enabling this button in here. And let me disable the wireframe, and you can see we have something now showing up in the viewport, but the UVs seem to be wrong, so we have to fix that in the next step. So this mapping type is set to 3ds Max standard, and down here we are using the explicit map channel. That's why we need to add some kind of UV to make it show up correctly. And let's use this spherical projection mode to have a projection mode that fits together with how the HDRI was captured. Then we can just move up and down this gizmo here. We can just choose something like this here as a start and then see what this will give us. So now we just need to rotate this dome into the right direction. So if you remember the backplate, we have this kind of building in here with this crane in the center and then this bigger part of the building on the left side. So if I unhide here this reflective and refractive dome, let's just rotate this until we kind of get the right direction. That would be this one here. We have the crane in the center, this bigger part of the building here on the left. And like this, we can first start the rendering and see what we get now. So you can see we obviously have some kind of reflective and refractive environment by now, because there's a lot of stuff here happening on the shading dummy, but there's a bunch of problems which we have to fix one by one. So the first problem is that we have this backplate not showing up anymore, and that is because our dome here is visible to the camera. So if I just make it not visible to the camera, then we have the backplate here showing up again and it's not overlaying the backplate itself anymore. Now let's unhide our floor mat again. And once we do this, we can see that somehow our shadow here seems to have disappeared. The reason for that is that this kind of dome here blocks the sunlight which is coming from outside. So we have to go into this object properties, and then also disable the receive and cast shadow options. As soon as we do this, we can see we have a shadow here turning up again. And while we're at it, let's also go in the VRay properties and just disable the generate, receive and visible to GI, because we already set this up with our sun and skylight, and we don't want this dome here to interfere with that. So I just disabled this so that everything is left like how it was before. And now if we just put back our diffuse shader, you can see we have the same result like we had before. If I put the reflective shader, now we have some kind of reflection here showing up. At the moment, the reflection is not really fitting yet to the backplate. I think it's way too bright. We need to adjust it in some way to make it look like it fits to here. But this we're gonna now tackle in the next step. So for this, we can just use a simple color correction. Just go on the VRay bitmap and add a simple color correction in here. Then also keep the old map as a submap, of course. And then inside this lightness tab, we can first try to match the correct contrast and the correct lightness in here. And with this RGB value down here, you can just define the overall brightness of this HDRI. We can choose, for example, something really dark like 10. And then the HDRI, of course, is way too dark now. We have to kind of find a value so that these kind of sky colors that we see in the backplate, they match here on our shading dummy. Also the same like this floor and these kind of like yellow lines in here. We have to find values so that all of this matches exactly, because remember, this shading dummy here is 100% reflective everywhere. So whatever sky color we have in here, it also should reflect the same way into this shading dummy here as well. So I can just go higher, for example, choose a value like 35. Then I feel like this kind of sky color in here and what we see in our shading dummy, they kind of match. And also the floor in terms of brightness, maybe you could even choose a slightly higher gamma so that the contrast here in this reflection is slightly reduced. And I think like this, it already looks quite fitting. I feel that these kind of floor lines here, they have a slightly different saturation value. I think they're a little bit more orangey, and those ones in here are a little bit more yellow. So you could choose a different hue, for example, something crazy like -50. But as you can see, like this way, you could adjust here the saturation and hue of those lines. In my case, for example, I just choose something like -10. And then I think those lines here, they look now quite fitting to the ones in the backplate. Additionally, you can choose different saturations. For example, you can make it much more saturated or desaturated and so on. I think you get the point. With this color correction, you can just do simple adjustments to your HDRI so that whatever you see here in the reflection kind of matches the backplate in here. So now this whole environment that we set up is not only for the reflections, but also for the refractions. So let's also just verify if this is working. So here we can just put a simple glass material inside, reduce this metalness to 0, diffuse color to black, and then the refraction all the way up to 255, so to pure white. And then let's just assign this glass material on this shading dummy, and then just make sure that it also seems to work. And like this way, you can see, yeah, it seems to work. We have like this kind of building showing up here in the refractions. Of course, it's upside down because that's how refractions basically work if this is a solid glass object in here. But you can see it's kind of aligned to the backplate. So now there's one last thing we have to address, and that is that we don't really have any shadows showing up in our reflections. So you can see we have this kind of shadow in here on the floor, but it doesn't really seem to show up here in our shading dummy. Actually, you can see that especially here on this chrome ball that I just put here temporarily, that it seems to be kind of floating. It's casting a shadow here, but this shadow is not really visible in the reflection itself. And that of course looks a little bit weird. So we have to address that. The reason for that is that everything that we see here in the reflection is actually this VRay light material here from our environment dome. And this one of course doesn't receive any kind of shadow. So we have to find some way to get a shadow show up also on top of this environment dome here in our reflections. So here you can see the whole kind of setup at the moment. We have this environment dome in here. Then we have this ground plane here to catch the shadow, but the shadow doesn't really turn up in the reflections because we disabled the visibility of our matte objects in the reflection and just derive everything from this dome in here. Then of course we also have like the sunlight and skylight. So how do we get a shadow now appearing in the reflections? For this we can just take our floor mat, let's just duplicate it and then just call it floor shadow here. And then we just move it slightly higher than our floor mat object. So let's say if this one here is 0 centimeters, then let's just move this one here to 1 centimeter. So just very slightly on top of it. We can also move it to its own layer in here. And then we just need to put all the render settings that we enabled in here back to default. So we just make it visible in the reflection and refractions, and then just go inside here, not make it this matte for reflection and refraction, not make it a matte object. Also disable all of these things here, put this one back to 1, and then also just leave everything to how it was before, to the default values in here. Now we just need to assign a shader to this geometry, and let's just open the material editor again. Let's move down to a free spot. Let's just add a new VRay material. Now let's rename this here to shader shadow, and let's just assign this onto this new shadow geometry in here, and then start a new rendering and see what happens. So you can see a big change now. Of course we have to adjust it in some way. First of all, I think it's too high now on top of our original ground plane. So you can see these things here, they sink a little bit into the floor. So let's just make it to 0.1 centimeters. So just slightly on top of our matte object here. And now we just need to make it, of course, not visible in the primary visibility. So we disable this one here. And then we also disable the cast shadows. So it's not casting any shadow onto our matte object. So once we have this, we can see now we only see these things here appearing up in the reflection and refractions. So let's just go here to the VRay properties, also disable all of these GI options in here. And now we just need to make sure that here our original floor from the environment shows through again, and we only keep like this kind of shadow from this part in here. And now we just need to care about how we can show through here our floor. The previous floor we did from this environment dome, and inside here the opacity map, we can just choose a fall off map, and then this fall off you can switch to the shadow light type. Once you do this and then switch this, then basically these kind of parts that receive light become transparent. The ones that don't receive light, they stay opaque. Now we just need to go inside here and change our diffuse color to black. Once we do this, you can see down here, for example, we have the shadow now appearing in the reflections on top of our geometry dome floor. So I think now it looks much better. The only thing we can do still is to, as you can see here, this kind of opacity mode, the stochastic one, has some problems with these kind of like half transparencies. So normally I just switch here to this normal mode. This one is a little bit slower, but you can see this one looks basically much better. So just to be sure that there's no artifacts here appearing in our shadow. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this two-part class about how to integrate some objects into backplates. So in a nutshell, the important thing is to make these two different shaders here work first, preferably on very simple objects. So one shader would be this diffuse shader without any reflections. So this one just makes sure that your lighting and your GI works correctly. And then you have a purely reflective shader. And this one just makes sure that your whole environment is set up correctly and all the intensities and so on are matching. And then if you have those two here set up, then you just can load any kind of object into your scene. As long as the shaders are set up correctly, it will look fitting into this environment, and it should really much reduce your workflow in order to try to match something into the backplates. So if you watch those tutorials until here, chances are that you also enjoy the content that I provide on my Patreon. For example, I have a whole course about car rendering and car shading that you can check out over there. And you can also download all of my scenes files and watch additional bonus videos for my classes. So head out over there if that has any additional value for you. Other than that, subscribe to this channel to not miss out on any future updates. Leave a comment or a like, and see you in the next tutorials.